The lights were bright, the band played its usual cheerful riff, and Jimmy Kimmel leaned into his desk with a grin he'd worn for decades. It was supposed to be another routine night in late-night television. Banter, jokes, and a Hollywood legend on the couch, but within minutes, the entire studio would be holding its breath, the audience caught between gasps and nervous laughter, as Clint Eastwood, yes, that Clint Eastwood, the man who had defined American cinema for generations, glared across the desk with a look that could cut glass. And then it happened. In front of the cameras, in front of the studio crowd, in front of millions at home, Clint Eastwood stood, delivered a line sharp enough to silence the band mid-note, and walked off Jimmy Kimmel's stage. The feed cut seconds later. No outro? No wrap-up joke? Just the image of one of Hollywood's most unshakable icons turning his back on a host who had finally pushed too far. The night began with thunderous applause. As the announcer bellowed Clint Eastwood's name, the audience rose to its feet, clapping wildly, some whistling, others shouting his name like they were greeting an old friend. The band played a triumphant riff, and there he was, the legend himself, tall even in his old age, his presence commanding the room the way it always had. Clint walked slowly but firmly toward the stage, dressed in a sharp dark suit, his expression calm, his movements deliberate. There was no need for theatrics. He didn't have to wave wildly or grin from ear to ear. He was Clint Eastwood. His mere arrival was enough to electrify the studio. Jimmy Kimmel stood to greet him, his trademark smirk already tugging at the corners of his mouth. He reached out for a handshake, and Clint accepted it with a firm grip, his eyes steady, his jaw tight. The audience cheered louder, soaking in the image. The king of late night and the king of the silver screen, side by side under the bright studio lights. They sat. Jimmy adjusted his cards, leaned back into his chair, and delivered his first line. Clint Eastwood, ladies and gentlemen. The man who's been squinting at bad guys for so long, I'm starting to think his eyes are permanently stuck that way. The crowd laughed. Clint gave a faint smile, tilting his head slightly, but he didn't laugh. He simply folded his hands in his lap, letting the moment pass. Jimmy pressed on, sensing the opening. Seriously, Clint, you've been making movies for what, 7 decades now? You're like the Energizer Bunny of tough guys. Still going, still growling, still terrifying anyone who tries to mess with you. The audience chuckled again. Clint smirked politely, but his eyes flickered with something sharper. Not anger, but a kind of warning. The kind of look that had silenced entire saloons in his movies. Jimmy shuffled his cards again, grinning wider. But let's be honest, Clint. At this point, if you walk into a room and say, "Get off my lawn," people actually listen. Probably because they think you mean it. The laughter was louder this time, but something was off. Clint didn't even smirk. He leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening, his eyes fixed on Jimmy. The audience's laughter wavered, unsure whether to keep going. Jimmy noticed. He chuckled awkwardly, raising his hands. Hey, come on, Clint, I'm kidding. You've built your whole career on that tough guy stare. It's iconic. It's a compliment. Clint leaned forward, his voice low, gravelly, and unmistakably serious. Doesn't feel like one, the audience gasped. The laughter died instantly. Jimmy blinked, his smirk faltering for the first time. He shuffled his cards again, stammering slightly. Well, okay, let's talk about your new movie. The shift was palpable. The energy that had been easy, breezy, late-night banter was gone. The crowd leaned forward in their seats, sensing it. This wasn't a playful guest rolling with the punches. This was Clint Eastwood, and he wasn't playing games. Jimmy tried again, his voice lighter, almost pleading. So, Clint, in this new film, you're playing another strong, silent type. How do you keep finding ways to play, well, yourself? The audience chuckled softly. Clint's lips twitched, but his eyes remained locked on Jimmy, sharp and unwavering. Maybe I don't see it as playing myself, he said slowly. Maybe I see it as doing the work. Something you might not understand. The crowd gasped again, louder this time. Jimmy's face flushed. He chuckled nervously, scratching the back of his head. Wow, okay, strong words. Clint didn't blink. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze unbroken. Words matter, Jimmy, even jokes. You should know that. The silence was thick now. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jimmy shuffled his cards again, but his hands trembled slightly. The smirk that usually disarmed his guests had no power here. Clint Eastwood wasn't laughing, and everyone in the room could feel it. The air was different. The warmth was gone. The stage was primed for something no one expected. The silence stretched just long enough to make the audience uneasy. Jimmy Kimmel's smile twitched, his usual rhythm gone. He shuffled his cards again, buying time, forcing out a chuckle that sounded hollow in the thick air of the studio. Okay, he said, tilting his head toward Clint. I guess I struck a nerve, but come on. You can't seriously tell me you've never leaned into the tough guy thing. You practically invented it. People squint at their neighbors now and call it the Clint Eastwood look. The audience laughed weakly, trying to fill the void. Clint didn't move. He leaned back in his chair, his arms folding across his chest. His eyes, cold and narrow, stayed locked on Jimmy. Difference is, Clint said, his gravelly voice low but sharp enough to slice the silence, I don't squint for laughs. Gasps echoed across the studio. A nervous ripple of chuckles followed, but they died quickly, smothered by Clint's unflinching stare. Jimmy's grin faltered, his eyes flicking to the crowd, then back to his guest. He tapped his pen against the desk, a habit that betrayed his nerves. Well, Jimmy said, trying again, if you're not squinting for laughs. You sure gave us plenty of them tonight. Clint leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice rising just enough to cut across the audience. You think this is funny? The crowd went silent. Jimmy blinked, his smile collapsing. It's a comedy show, Clint. That's what we do here. We laugh. Clint's jaw tightened. He tilted his head slightly, the way he had in countless films just before delivering a devastating line. No. What you do here is hide behind jokes. You take shots at people, and when they fire back, you laugh it off and call it comedy. That's not humor. That's cowardice! The room exploded. Gasps, cheers, whistles, shouts. The audience was split down the middle, some clapping furiously, others frozen in disbelief. The band members glanced at one another, their instruments untouched, the tension too heavy to play over. Jimmy leaned back, his face red, his smirk gone. He raised his hand like a shield, his voice trembling with sarcasm. All right, Dirty Harry, easy there. Don't shoot the host, the crowd groaned. Nervous laughter scattered in pockets, but Clint didn't budge. His glare deepened, his voice sharper now. Don't hide behind the movies. I'm not playing a role right now. The air was suffocating. The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing they were witnessing something unscripted, something raw. Jimmy opened his mouth to speak, but Clint beat him to it. You brought me here to talk about the work, Clint said, his words deliberate, his tone steady. But you can't help yourself. You poke, you prod. You laugh at the legend because you don't know how to face the man. The crowd gasped again, louder this time. Jimmy's hand trembled as he set down his pen. His smirk had disappeared completely now, replaced by something closer to fear, or at least the awareness that he had lost control. The confrontation was no longer banter. It was a duel. Jimmy shifted in his seat, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to reclaim control. Look, Clint, it's late-night television. Everyone gets teased here. Actors, politicians, athletes, everyone. You're not special. The words landed with a thud. The crowd groaned again, a murmur of disapproval rippling through the room. Clint leaned forward slowly, his hands clasped together, his eyes never leaving Jimmy. Not special? He repeated, his tone low, dangerous. I didn't come here looking to be special. I came here looking to be respected. The audience erupted. Claps, cheers, shouts. Jimmy raised his hands, waving for calm, but his voice cracked under the pressure.
All right, let's take it down a notch.
Nobody's disrespecting you. Clint's laugh was short, humorless. He shook his head, his voice cold as steel. You don't even know when you're doing it. That's the problem. The studio was chaos now. Some audience members cheered him on. Others shouted for Jimmy to fight back. Security shifted nervously at the edge of the stage, their eyes fixed on Clint's towering frame, ready in case the tension broke into something worse. Jimmy leaned into his desk, his voice desperate, his smirk gone entirely. Clint, listen! But Clint cut him off, his voice booming across the studio, silencing the crowd. No, you listen. I've spent my whole life building something, and I'll be damned if I let some smug late-night host tear it down with a smirk. The audience roared. Some rose to their feet, clapping wildly. Others gasped, their hands covering their mouths. The noise was overwhelming, a wave of chaos crashing against the stage. Jimmy's face flushed deep red. He tried to speak again, his words stumbling out. I was just... It's all in good fun. Clint leaned closer, his voice cutting him down instantly. There's nothing fun about disrespect. The studio froze. The silence that followed was louder than the noise. Jimmy's lips pressed together, his eyes darting around the room, searching for escape. Clint leaned back in his chair, his arms crossing again, his glare unrelenting. The energy in the room was unbearable now, the legend and the host locked in a battle neither could step away from. And then, the escalation tipped. Jimmy, his voice trembling but desperate to regain control, forced a smirk back onto his face. "Well, Clint, if you can't take a joke, maybe late-night TV isn't the place for you." The words detonated. The audience gasped so loudly it drowned out the band. Clint's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed into the kind of glare that had ended movie villains' lives on screen. He leaned forward one final time, his voice low, deadly calm. "You're right. It isn't." The crowd screamed, some in shock, others cheering. The escalation had peaked. The atmosphere was volcanic. Clint Eastwood had drawn the line, and everyone in the studio knew it. The next moment would decide everything. The studio air was razor-sharp. Clint Eastwood's last words, "You're right. It isn't." It still hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. The audience shifted in their seats, torn between gasping and applauding, their energy pulsing through the room like electricity. Jimmy Kimmel forced a laugh. It came out thin, nervous, and awkward. He shuffled his cards again, his fingers trembling, and tried to deliver another line. "You know, Clint, you sound like you're about to give me one of those dirty Harry speeches. Do I feel lucky right now?" "Not really," the audience laughed weakly, their voices faltering. Even they could tell it wasn't landing. Clint leaned back slowly, his jaw tight, his eyes cold. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Jimmy pressed harder, desperate now. His smirk turned sharp, his voice rising as he leaned forward. "Come on, Clint, don't be so sensitive. You've been in Hollywood forever. People make jokes about you all the time. It's part of being a legend, isn't it?" Taking it with a smile? The words landed like a slap. The audience groaned audibly, the tension spiking again. Clint sat up straight, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He turned his head toward Jimmy, his glare burning, his voice dropping into the gravelly tone that had silenced villains and anti-heroes alike for 50 years. "You want to smile, Jimmy?" he said slowly, deliberately. "Then earn it. Don't hide behind cheap shots." The crowd exploded. Cheers, claps, whistles, shouts. Some audience members leapt to their feet, clapping furiously, while others gasped, stunned at the sharpness of the retort. Jimmy's face flushed crimson. He looked around wildly, his eyes darting from the cameras to the producers in the wings, searching for backup, but none came. And then he made the mistake. The final jab, the one that snapped the cord completely. Jimmy leaned back, smirk creeping back onto his lips. "All right, Clint, if you can't take a joke at your age, maybe you really are too old for this." The audience gasped so loudly it drowned out the band. The sound echoed across the studio like a wave of shock. Even the cameramen froze, their lenses shaking slightly as they captured the moment. Clint didn't move for a beat. His eyes narrowed, his jaw set, his silence louder than anything he could have said. The audience leaned forward, bracing, and then he stood. Slowly, deliberately, his tall frame rising under the hot studio lights. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, the sound slicing through the stunned silence. The cameras tilted up, catching every inch of his movement. He looked down at Jimmy, his voice calm, steady, final. "You don't get to talk to me like that." Gasps and cheers erupted simultaneously. Some audience members clapped wildly, others booed, but no one sat still. The tension was volcanic. Jimmy's smirk vanished instantly. His mouth opened, but no words came. His hands twitched nervously on his desk. He looked rattled, completely out of his depth. Clint shook his head once, slowly. Then he turned, his footsteps echoing as he walked toward the wings. The breaking point had come, and Clint Eastwood had chosen to leave. The studio was chaos. The audience screamed, some shouting, "No!" while others cheered Clint on, their claps reverberating across the walls. Security guards shifted nervously near the stage, unsure whether to step in, though it was clear Clint didn't need them. He walked with deliberate calm, his figure towering under the bright lights, his presence dominating even as he moved away. Jimmy Kimmel sat frozen at his desk, his smirk gone, his face pale. He shuffled his cards again, dropping them with a loud smack. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "Ladies and gentlemen, Clint Eastwood." The words sounded hollow, awkward, drowned out by the roar of the crowd. Some booed Jimmy, others clapped for Clint, the energy split down the middle. Clint reached the edge of the stage. He paused for half a second, turned his head slightly and muttered into the air, not to Jimmy, not to the cameras, but to the room itself, "Show some respect." The audience erupted. Whistles, screams, claps shaking the rafters. The cameraman swung wildly to catch his final steps, zooming out as his figure disappeared into the wings. Jimmy sat stiffly, gripping his desk, his forced smile trembling. He tried one last line, his voice cracking under the noise. "Well, guess he really did make my day." The joke fell flat. The audience groaned audibly. Jimmy's smile collapsed entirely, his face dropping as he shuffled his papers again, his hands visibly shaking. The cameras stayed wide, capturing the chaos. Clint gone. Jimmy rattled. The studio split in pandemonium. The noise surged louder, the audience refusing to settle. The producers waved frantically off stage, signaling to cut the broadcast. And then, the feed dropped. No outro. No music, no polished joke to smooth it over. Just a cold, abrupt cut to black. The final image burned into millions of screens. Clint Eastwood walking off with unshakable dignity, and Jimmy Kimmel left alone at his desk, pale, humiliated, and silenced.